Hello, my name is Thomas McCurdy, and today I'll be presenting on synthesized soundscapes, how musical inventors and inventive musicians helped shape the sounds of the future. During our generation, no instrument has gone under an incredible amount of growth and transformation quite like the synthesizer has. What started as an experimental, plucky combination of music and machine quickly transcended into a pop disco phenomenon that would impact the style of music to come and shape the course of songwriting history. I've been fascinated with synthesizers and, to a greater extent, electronic music for a very long time. Part of the allure of synthesizers, for me, has to do with the variety of sounds that can be created with them. Nothing gets a song stuck in my head quite like a bright synth melody, a sharp and driving bass line, or a warm synth pad. But despite the monumental impact that synthesizers have had on the music industry, I find that a lot of prominent composers and advocates of the lovable music-making machines often go overlooked or unnoticed in music history. So today, I would like to talk about the early days of synthesis. What advances in technology eventually led to the creation of the synthesizer, and the iconic sounds that we associate with it? And who were some of the industry pioneers that took that equipment and used it to create the music of the future? Afterwards, I want to discuss the relentlessly surging popularity of synthesis among both wannabe music creators and the musicians that are creating this decade's most memorable hits. This presentation was born primarily out of my love for synthesizers, and I want to share my passion in as many ways as I can. I understand that synthesis can appear to be a difficult and costly thing to get into, even for more experienced musicians, so I'll share some simple and easy tools at the end of this presentation to help anybody get into playing with synthesizers. I hope you enjoy. So first, we should probably cover what a synthesizer is. Simply put, a synthesizer is an electronic instrument that generates its sound either through digital or analog processing. So essentially what that means is they all are built on oscillators, which can generate a certain sound wave, such as like a sine wave, a triangle wave, a saw wave, or a square wave. And then features from the synthesizer like filters and amplifiers can further manipulate those oscillators to change, for example, maybe their frequencies or their volumes. They can make the wave go faster or slower. They can make it wider or thinner to affect its volume. There are a lot of different kinds of synthesis that exist. The method that I kind of just described is the most basic, or I want to say first kind of synthesis, which is subtractive synthesis. But there's also things like additive synthesis, which is sort of the opposite, where more filters are added on top of the wave to make it even brighter. And then FM, or frequency modulation, or synthesis, which takes one inaudible sound wave and that sort of warps or affects another audible sound wave. So you can kind of see from this graph here, there's the main oscillator. This appears to be a saw wave, and then they have this low pass filter, which can either make like the high end of the sound prominent or the low end of the sound prominent. And then there's this ASDR envelope that stands for attack, decay, sustain, release. So that basically affects like when you press a key or a note, like how loud the note will come in, when the note will come in, how long it'll be sustained for, and when you let go of the note, how long the kind of tail end of it will last. And all those elements kind of combine to make the output of the synthesized noise. When you think of synthesizers, you may be picturing a large wall of knobs and wires that are all interconnected. That's usually considered like modular synthesis, which is all made of separate modules. That's kind of as complicated as synthesis can get, but back when synthesis started, it came from much earlier and more humble roots, and that's where the theremin comes in. The early days of synthesis were especially interesting because, much like the early days of any new kind of instrument, no established groundwork had really been set for how the instrument should work, which meant a lot of different people were experimenting with making electronics musical and had a lot of different and unique ways to do that. One of the most prominent examples of an early electronic instrument is the theremin. It was developed by Russian musician Leon Theremin in 1920, and its bizarre construction is only overshadowed by its iconic and eerie sound. The theremin was conceptualized somewhat accidentally, with Leon discovering in 1918 that the feedback coming from a transmitter-receiver that he was building had changed in pitch based on his hand's distance from the receiver. And then soon after, he had built a fully functional theremin, which allowed the performer to change the pitch and volume of a frequency by merely moving their hand. So you can see here in this picture, he's actually conducting with one hand, and then he's using this other one to affect the theremin. It's essentially this radio antenna here, but then based on your hand's sort of distance with it, like up and down or left and right, he's adjusting the frequency of it and the volume. He kind of toured in the America around 1930s with it, and he saw sort of moderate popularity of that and getting it patented. But around then the Great Depression happened, and it saw that not many performers could afford the luxury instrument, and then its popularity kind of waned out up until the 1950s. What made the theremin especially notable was that its sort of weird and warbly sound was not contained by a typical 12-tone system, so it sort of closely mimicked the human voice and how it sort of glided between pitches. As such, it was mostly well known for being used in like movie scores. Like I think Ghostbusters is a pretty popular example of it, actually. Another good example that came out of France is called the Ondes Martenot. I probably butchered the pronunciation of that, but this is another really cool early synthesizer instrument. It was developed in 1928 by inventor Maurice Martenot, and it has a familiar sort of keyboard layout, but there's actually a lot of other things going on with it. So you can kind of see to the left there's this pressure-sensitive lever that is used to adjust the volume of the noise that's being played. And even though it has this sort of keyboard layout, there's actually a ring on a string that can be used to glide between pitches, and then you can sort of like wiggle the ring to create like a nice vibrato effect. The Ondes Martenot found its early success in classical compositions, most notably in works by French composer Messiaen, who I'm sure some of you at least have heard about before. The weird instrument stands out as a combination of the otherworldly tone of a theremin with the conventional setup of a keyboard. Most notably, it demonstrates that a familiar-looking instrument can be full of versatility when it harnesses the power of electronics, a concept that later commercial synthesizers would also aim to prove. Here's just a really quick video demonstration of how the Ondes Martenot works to sort of give you a better idea of it.
You hear more timbres like this one.
It's a lever that creates the volume. It's creating that vibrato with the ring.
Sometimes it's more aggressive. This way.
It's so cool.
But,
so the innovations of the theremin and the Ondes Martenot would eventually lead to prove that there was an audience that was receptive to electronics being incorporated into music, especially like sort of experimental music. There's one man that was responsible for taking electronic music and trying to bring it more into the mainstream with his new innovative inventions. And that man is Robert Moog, right here. Robert Moog was the creator of the Moog modular synthesizer, which established the ideal format for nearly all future synthesizers to come. Chances are, if you picture like a typical synthesizer in your head, it resembles very closely what the Moog used to be. You know, the big wall of like knobs and wires and levers and a keyboard under it that people would play on. Moog almost seemed destined to create his titular synthesizer. He was enamored with electronics from a very young age and had a passion for exploring the relationship between circuitry and sound. Born in 1934, Moog was growing up in a time where electronics were just beginning to revolutionize media, through radio and television, and anybody could pursue building their own electronic creations as a hobby. Moog found himself especially drawn to the theremin. He built his own functional theremin using Popular Electronics magazine instructions at the age of 14, and then by 19, he was building and selling them alongside his father as a family business. Moog even cited Leon Theremin as the person who had single-handedly launched the field of electronic music technology. Before Moog was building theremins of his own, he attended the Manhattan School of Music as a teenager, where he received ear training, music theory, and sight singing lessons. Despite his parents wishing for him to have a more musical upbringing, Moog kind of rebelled, I guess, as far as being a music rebel can be, and he got his bachelor's degree in physics and his master's in electrical engineering. Eventually, Moog's knowledge of musical concepts and his affinity for electronics would combine to form the first commercial modular analog synthesizer. After meeting with composer Herb Deutsch in 1963 and discussing ways to have a version of synthesis to experiment with at home, Moog drew up a prototype for the seminal synthesizer. In 1964, he debuted 3 different models, which soon took off with various musicians eager to explore the new soundscapes that the Moog could provide. So, typically older synthesizers before Robert Moog's time were kind of restricted to universities, and they were kind of like old computers in the sense that they took up an entire room to play with, and they were very primitive. So you can see right here the Moog was still pretty big. Here's just an example of a Moog modular synthesizer. The thing is still giant, but it's a lot more reasonable than sort of the more academic synthesizers that came before it. One of the early pioneers of electronic music composition with the Moog synthesizer was Wendy Carlos. Born in 1939 and raised by a very musical family, Carlos would study the piano from a young age while also harboring a talent for the sciences. During high school, she won a Westinghouse Science Fair scholarship for her own home-built computer. Now, granted this is pretty early on, so it's probably not a computer in the sense that me and you are thinking about, but it's still really impressive stuff, especially for high school. Her affinity for both music and science ran in her blood as much as it did in Robert Moog's, but where Moog would go on to study engineering, Carlos chose to instead get her master's in music composition at Columbia University, where she studied at the first electronic music center in the U.S. After graduating, Carlos moved to New York to work as a recording engineer, which is where she befriended and began working with Moog. One of the most influential albums of the 60s that sort of helped demonstrate the musical capabilities of the Moog synthesizer was Carlos's very own Switched On Bach, which came out in 1968. One second. The album is a collection of various Bach pieces that were performed by Carlos herself on a Moog synthesizer. At the time, the Moog was used to create more sort of experimental music and sort of weird soundscapes, but Carlos simply wanted to make music on a synthesizer that was appealing to most general audiences and considered listenable. This greatly pleased Moog, as he had detested the experimental nature of most of the avant-garde music that was initially created with the synthesizer. He called it shoddy and flim-flam. Carlos worked very closely with Moog on the album as a result, and she had supplied him with sort of technical feedback on developing the Moog, as he had provided sort of the equipment in order for her to make the album. Working with Moog to create Switched On Bach proved to be a very arduous process for Carlos, as the Moog was monophonic and meant that only one note could be played on the synthesizer at a time, which meant that each note had to be painstakingly recorded individually. Wendy Carlos actually built her own sort of 8-track recorder to record sort of each piece of the Bach piece onto, and it was very it took a very long time and a lot of technical ingenuity on top of that. But yeah, despite even having to record each note one by one, the Moog would frequently go out of tune. In a 1999 interview, Carlos stated that only a measure or two could be recorded at once, 2 measures if you were lucky, before the Moog would drift out of tune and she would have to readjust the parameters on it. But as it turned out, the effort to suffer through that was worth it in the end. Switched On Bach would go on to be a commercial and critical success. More importantly, the album established that synthesizers could be used to create familiar sounding and inviting music with enough time and effort. The album exists as a bizarre blend of the old and the new, by taking the established musicality of Bach and recontextualizing it in a revolutionary new format. Carlos was able to demonstrate that synthesizers could create truly groundbreaking and memorable music that was also melodic and recognizable. Carlos would go on to cover more Bach songs in the future through other albums like The Well-Tempered Synthesizer and Switched On Bach 2, along with making synthesized music for Stanley Kubrick movies A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. Here's a short, sort of nice interview video I found of Carlos where she kind of talks about how she recorded the parts of Switched On Bach, and then also demonstrates her Moog synthesizer.
A pair of tracks which has all of the string section that sounds like this. There's a harpsichord track, and 2 flutes, and there's this nice solo that's split up into 2 tracks. Let's put them all together. I think it needs a little more echo. Yeah, that's good.
Her early work was with a Moog synthesizer. Though it's a museum piece now, when it was first introduced, it opened the door to a world of music synthesis.
So she recorded it on.
It works by first generating these harsh, bright sounds, made up of many pure tones played together.
We would pass these bright waves into a filter, which in this case, literally like your tone controls on a hi-fi set, remove portions or boost portions of the sound. We can make it sound very dull, quite pure, or very bright. And you can do this dynamically in time, so sort of percussive, or make it open up, make it sit up there.
The Moog was...
So yeah, I thought that was just a really excellent demonstration of how her early Moog synthesizer worked and how sort of that filter sort of ties into adjusting and transforming the sound of the synthesizer.
revolutionary.
So another composer who's one of my personal favorites in the world of early synthesis, who has a very versatile musical background actually, and also realized the potential of the Moog from a very early and sort of pioneer perspective, was Canadian-born Mort Garson. Garson got his start in the music industry by arranging pop hits during the 60s and 70s, and by writing easy listening albums and commercial jingles. After meeting with Robert Moog in 1967 and investing a whopping $15,000 into a synthesizer, Garson invested all of his creativity into the instrument and created an eclectic assortment of various albums, which covered topics ranging wildly from Satanism to children's literature. Pretty wild stuff. One such album of his is 1968's goofy yet sort of disturbing and unsettling The Wazard of Iz, an electronic odyssey, which is best described as a sort of psychedelic parody of The Wizard of Oz, which contains some weird sort of warped vocals and some very sparkly synth tones with some kind of occult undertones. It's a really bizarre mashup of themes, but it's really fun to listen to. A year after that, Garson would write music for CBS that accompanied their coverage of July's moon landing, which helped expose more of the general public to the spacey otherworldliness of synthesizer music. But the album that would eventually foster Garson's status as a cult electronic musician would unfortunately be his last solo work. 1976's Mother Earth's Plantasia was a collection of warm, pleasant melodies that Garson wrote especially for plants. Initially, the album was only available to those who purchased a plant from the Mother Earth Plant Boutique in Los Angeles, which probably explains why it didn't sell very well when it initially came out. The album harkens back to Garson's earlier roots, pun intended, in lounge music and easy listening, and it represents a departure from the more occult and menacing synth music that he had made just a few years prior. Like most revolutionary pioneers in their medium, however, Garson's works and innovations with the synthesizer weren't really recognized right away. Garson's reputation as a synth pioneer hadn't really gained any momentum until the 2010s, around then, where his music was discovered by people going through thrift shops or old record stores, and they heard it and they liked it, so they shared it online. So a lot of Garson's synth works are considered cult status nowadays, and they sort of survive through reissue campaigns to, expose his music to a new generation of music and music lovers. Kind of makes him seem ahead of his time as an innovator in the synthesizer, but he's one of my personal favorite composers for the instrument, and I feel like he's done a lot to advance the medium. Since Moog hadn't patented his synth designs at all, many other synthesizers from different brands began to crop up. Another iconic synth that came out in 1971 was ARP Instruments' ARP 2600. Unlike the Moog before it, the ARP's basic components were pre-wired in, which meant, it's what you get in the box is what you had to play with. This meant it was ideal for musicians that were sort of unfamiliar with synthesis or sort of intimidated by it, or for students that were looking for a place to start learning synthesis. The ARP didn't catch on quite like Moog's instruments had, but many musicians championed the synthesizer regardless. Notable examples include Stevie Wonder, Herbie Hancock, and Edgar Winter for some of their jazz, funk fusion, and rock stuff, just to name a few popular composers that were champions of the instrument. Ben Burtt, who's a pretty prominent sound designer, he designed like the sound effects and stuff for the original Star Wars movies, actually used the ARP 2600 to create R2-D2's voice. He used sort of the synthesized bleeps and bloops and combined it with like a heavily filtered version of his voice to create R2-D2's iconic like robotic sounds. I thought that was a really nice, cute, fun fact, and it demonstrates how the ARP 2600 wasn't just used for like, you know, music and just rocking out on a synthesizer, but also was used for its versatility in sound design. Back in the 60s and 70s, synths were beginning to shake up the music industry, but it was still hard for the average musician to get into synthesis. Most of the musicians that championed early synthesizers had the synths usually provided to them by the manufacturer, like Wendy Carlos, or they just had like a bunch of money, like Mort Garson apparently did. This all changed, however, in the 1980s, with the release of the Yamaha DX7. The DX7 sort of differed from its synthesizer ancestors in that it was a digital frequency modulation synth, which meant that it was able to create a lot of really bright and glassy tones that were able to more accurately emulate real instrument sounds. Yamaha's development into large-scale integration chips also meant that the DX7 could be manufactured at a rate higher and a cost far lower than competing analog synthesizers at the time. As a result of this, the Yamaha DX7 would go on to be wildly commercially successful and have over 150,000 units ordered within its first year. While frequency modulation is extremely difficult to program for most musicians, it's still really intimidating to try to program today, take it from me, the DX7's bright and glossy presets would go on to define the sounds of the 80s, most notably in pop music. Songs like Danger Zone, Take On Me, and How Will I Know champion the distinctive sounds of the DX7 and distinguish the synthesizer as a dominant force in pop rock music. I guarantee you, if you think of any song from the 80s, like any pop song or rock song, and you think of any like sort of weird synthesizer stuff in it, 99% of the time that's going to be a DX7. Brian Eno is well known for deep diving into his own DX7 and learning how to program FM synthesis and mastering it, and he created his own unique sounds with the DX7 to form what would become the basis of ambient music as a genre. The DX7 created a very clear divide in synthesizer types, as it moved away from the warm, imprecise tones of analog synthesis to pursue a sound that is considered by many to be colder, brighter, and sharper. Due to its lower price and accessible presets, however, the DX7 was able to bring synthesizers to the forefront as a futuristic sound with mass appeal, to a degree far more successful than its analog counterparts. So, how can you become a synthesizer rock star? Well, nowadays, anyone can get into playing with synthesizers, as there's so many different kinds that cover an extremely expansive range of like prices and models, so there's a lot to pick from there. Moog is still creating and selling its very own hardware synths that both push the industry forward with quality of life features while still acknowledging its legacy and iconic sound. Other companies like Arturia have built several software synthesizers that emulate the sounds and functionalities of very old classic synths as a compact download for your desktop. Various software synths also exist for free, meaning that as long as you have an audio workstation on your computer, you can experiment with synthesizers yourself. Some completely free synthesizers that I really enjoy playing around with are Daiichi Laboratories' Synth1 and Digital Suburban's Dexed. Synth1 has been circulating around the internet since 2001, and for good reason. While its interface, as you can probably see here, is rather dated looking, it's relatively easy to understand and intuitive enough to make some fantastic sounds right out of the gate. Dexed is a software emulation of the Yamaha DX7. It may initially look pretty intimidating, but it sounds great, just like the real thing. Dexed even comes as a standalone application, meaning you can run on your computer without needing an audio workstation. Ableton also has a web tutorial dedicating to help anyone learn the basics of synthesis, all within your browser. It does a great job of breaking down all of the core elements of synthesizers and displaying them in a minimalistic and interactive context. So I'd encourage you to check it out, or check any of these tools out if you're interested in any kind of synthesis. They're all completely free on the internet. So, I hope you enjoyed my presentation on the early days of synthesizers, and I hope that inspires you to experiment with synthesizers of your own. There's so many topics I didn't get to cover, such as Euro racks, drum machines, and sort of microtonal music that can be created with synthesizers, but I encourage you to research all the different kinds of electronic music makers that exist out there. It's clear that electronic instruments have come a long way since the early days of the Theremin. Thanks to the inventive innovators of engineers like Leon Theremin and Robert Moog, and to the works of composers like Wendy and Mort Garson, the synthesizer was able to make a sizable impact on the music industry and transform the way we experience music and experience soundscapes today. Now synthesizers are still evolving, and they're easier to get into more than ever, so I encourage you to go out there and just look at some synthesizers and explore some of the compositions that exist, especially nowadays with synthesizers, and some of the tools you get to play with in electronic music making.